Ocean Green, a novel by Evan Schiefelbine, with reading by Lee Smith and music by Reverend Barron. Chapter 1. Some of the best Sunday afternoons of Hector's life would happen in the water. Either in the water or close to it anyway. It wouldn't always have to be a lake or an ocean or anything that vast. There were the backyard pools and high desert creeks, the yard hoses and sprinklers of his childhood in Downey, and then other things like the thick drops that accompanied thunder and lightning storms during a few summer vacations. Those storms were always a thrill as long as the electric bolts were far away enough to be exciting and not life-threatening. When he was a boy, there was one afternoon that hid him and his cousins underneath the shelter of a rock formation as lightning shook the earth below them. But aside from that instance, he liked lightning. He was mainly concerned with motion sickness and altitude sickness. These were two foes that, even under mild conditions, would cause him to lose control of his bowels, and in some cases cause him to shit uncontrollably. Hector had spent the week in the grass and tree-covered spaces around Los Angeles. He'd anticipated the beaches. Everyone thinks of the beaches ahead of their arrival to California. Yet finding so many new green spaces around the city since returning was to him surprising, and he wasn't going to deny what was having such a positive effect on him. Griffith Park's Narrows and the slopes surrounding Echo Lake were near the top of his list, but the grass along Point Fermin had become his preferred destination for afternoon naps. The Pacific Ocean tides below the Point's cliffs had a calming effect that worked for him. For the past 3 years, he'd been away at grad school in Seattle studying architecture. It was an interval of time that was now just long enough to allow him to underestimate the pace of the LA sprawl that was now pushing at him from all sides. With his return to the LA basin, the surges of his anxiety seemed to be doubling in force. There were a dozen identifiable factors responsible for this, but it was likely rooted in the humming undercurrent of terror he felt as the city's freeway traffic wove paths around him at speeds that were in no way acceptable. And it wasn't only on the freeways. Occasionally residential street traffic would accelerate and swerve around him on the most seemingly tranquil side streets. It was his reintroduction to the Southern California style of driving, fast with varying degrees of selfish risk. Beyond the roadways, there was the cityscape that looked so much different than the cities of the green north. It was all endless cement color tones. Up above was an almost daily layer of haze smog. Down below the haze, it seemed everyone was driving a new car. These observations and speculations helped pass the time. They were needed distractions for Hector. He listed them off in his head throughout his daily drives, reacquainting himself with the area, and he'd sometimes laugh aloud as he witnessed a random motorist achieve a new standard in automotive recklessness. Driving around LA, more than anything, helped limit the distance his mind might wander. It eased the pressure of his thoughts bending toward a topic that, above all others, he didn't want to think about. It had been nearly 3 years since the death of his parents. A deer had appeared in the winding lanes of a Utah mountain highway. His father swerved to dodge it. The car was found in a meadow at the bottom of a steep incline hours later. At first, Hector swung between tears and self-applied numbness. The funeral came and went, and then he was on a plane back to Seattle. His friends pushed him toward therapy, but Hector preferred to escape the heartbreak with his schoolwork, with his architecture. And now his architecture had brought him home to Los Angeles for the summer. With his return came a flood of memories. The view of the city sprawl in the night and the freeways, they produced a current of thoughts from his childhood. And with these memory currents generally followed thoughts around how long his own life would last, and what he would do with it if he had enough time. The westbound traffic on the 110 flew outside his Crown Victoria Interceptor windows. With one hand on the wheel and one hand flipping a booklet of mixed CDs, his eyes moved back and forth from the freeway lanes and down toward his search for a burned disc. He went to great lengths to update new mixes in his booklet. Burning discs was long out of fashion with the arrival of streaming music, but his emerald green Crown Victoria wasn't equipped with the needed inputs or technology for streaming. If Hector was honest with himself, he felt more paralyzed by the endless options of streaming services than he did empowered by them. As he located an older disc, he looked up to see a blue SUV swerve across the toll lane dividers, nearly grazing the driver's side bumper of his Crown Victoria. He slammed his horn and dug his foot into the gas pedal. This near collision wasn't just about Hector's safety, it was also about the safety of this car, which for the last 2 weeks had been something like his temporary home. Cutting off a handful of uninvolved sedans, he swerved in and around lanes to catch up. The freeway traffic was open and flying. Hector moved to higher speeds across openings and began to close in on his newfound adversary. The retaliation would be improvised, but he knew it would involve a middle finger as well as bookending his statements with the phrase, "fuck off." His planned confrontation was on track until a family in a minivan brought Hector back to his usual overcautious state. The Crown Victoria nearly clipped the minivan's rear bumper before Hector was forced to swerve into the freeway shoulder lane at 90 miles per hour. The unkempt lane's dust and debris kicked up around the Crown Victoria's tires as pebbles nipped at the emerald green exterior. Similar to awakening from a dream, Hector awoke to himself and engaged the brakes before the initial shock of the near collision. The sun had begun its descent toward the horizon, shining its golden hues of light as Hector's emerald green sedan turned into the cliffside parking lot. It was a lucky Sunday. Hector acknowledged the luck when he spotted an open parking spot alongside the Point Fermin grass. The lawn was filled with family gatherings, afternoon dates, and solitary wanderers. Hector knew he was one of these solitary wanderers too. He stood out more than most due to his tall frame, long waves of black hair, and an oversized white Oxford shirt. Under the brim of his khaki bucket hat were brown eyes with narrow openings set above a serious brown-skinned face, and a thick mustache. As he exhaled the ocean air, his mind allowed him to enter a more relaxed state. But the atmosphere around him unexpectedly changed when he noticed the cobalt blue SUV from the freeway pursuit entering the lot. He knew it was the same one from the freeway, because like his Crown Victoria, this SUV had a golden exhaust pipe. There was also a sticker on the bumper in a fast font that he'd noticed earlier while in pursuit. Now he was able to read it clearly. Blexotech. All of these details, in addition to the already laid foundation of the freeway pursuit, amounted to an immediate confirmation of what Hector deemed an asshole. He knew his judgment was grounded in no facts, but he savored the light-hearted disgust that was overcoming his mind and emotions. Hector began to follow the driver and his girlfriend as they strolled from their car toward the cliffs. He thought to confront them until realizing that this situation was counter to the intentions of his afternoon plans. Before the blue SUV crossed his path, the goal of this trek to the cliffs was to relax and gather himself before the week. The air smelled like ocean and seaweed. He walked the length of the park and occasionally stopped to sit in the cooling grass for varying intervals of time. Once he'd wandered for long enough, he stopped to lay down and rest. Hector believed that one of the secrets to a good day off was a brief afternoon nap. He settled into a deep sleep quickly and touched the depths of a dreaming state. That was until a scream pulled him back up to the settings of Point Fermin, where a woman was standing directly over him calling for help. It took a moment to realize what was happening. Hector quickly found himself on his feet, frantically pumping reps of the Heimlich maneuver on a large, choking man until he was pushed out of the way by a larger, more built Angelino, who began doing the same. Out of breath, on his hands and knees, Hector looked up to see a larger Chicano, now also out of breath and wild-eyed, jolting reps against the choking man's sternum. As the second man's strength waned, a black man with average build grabbed hold of the choking individual and began a fresh armed attempt at freeing his breath. A crowd began to gather as the choking man's head and arms flailed like a doll. The entire park converged around the incident now as a Chinese woman broke into the center of the crowd, calmly announcing, "I'm a certified nurse. Please set him down." In unison, 4 men were lifting the choking man into the air and dropping him into an abrupt jolt. The woman repeated herself again, but it was as if they couldn't hear her. Foam bubbled from the side of his mouth. It was all a high-pitched blur, and Hector strained to look for some way to make use of himself. But this choking stranger was now surrounded and barely visible. Physical panic was emerging in the movements and faces of the individuals, pumping the man up and then down again. The continued lifting and dropping indicated to the growing crowd that the situation was getting worse. There were a total of 6 men lifting and dropping, and their confused efforts were beginning to show signs of desperation and fatigue. The nurse continued to calmly request that they cease the lifting and dropping, but it was as if their collective panic wouldn't allow for it. Uniformed paramedics armed with medical supplies and official-looking gear broke through the crowd and lowered the man on his back. He was unconscious and without air. The crowd fell silent with the realization that despite their best efforts, this man would likely die soon. Hector thought about running away. He didn't want to see the man's death, but the crowd surrounding the situation was too dense. The paramedics ordered the surrounding spectators back as they laid the man down and went to work. It was silent in the park as the crowd tightened into each other to give the rescue team space. "He's breathing," someone finally called out, but the crowd remained silent as if the information they just heard couldn't be accepted as the truth until each spectator could see it with their own eyes. The paramedics confirmed he was, in fact, breathing again, and the stunned crowd began to clap. It was true. Hector could see the area below the choker's left rib cage rising and falling in large and rapid waves above the grass. The medics brought the man's wife over in an attempt to confirm that he could remember his name and the name and face of his partner, which he did eventually do, once he gained the composure to do so. He wept in the arms of his wife, and the crowd clapped again, and then eventually receded in shaken silence. Hector walked toward the cliffs to look at the boats under the remaining dusk light. His hands gripped the guard railing as his arms continued to shake nervously. He walked back to his car to grab a tall can of beer that was still cold enough to enjoy. A doo-wop song played from a car close by. Birds and bats looked the same, fluttering quietly between the silhouetted trees above. Hector was exhausted and scared for everyone he loved. The desire to head back to the city flooded his mind. He wanted to get out from under this atmosphere that was hanging over the park tables, but he felt uneasy and worried that leaving at this moment would leave something about the afternoon unresolved. Leaning on the Crown Victoria with his Mexican lager, he watched as the medics walked the once choking man and his wife toward the parking lot. "It's okay, bud, he's alive," he uttered to his car, the same way a cowboy might assure their horse. El Monte Doo-wop was a good idea on Sundays. It was music that helped Hector calm down. The sound of doo-wop was familiar and comforting, especially years before, when he'd first moved to the Pacific Northwest and struggled with homesickness for LA. Turning on the car and adjusting his seatbelt, he paused before switching the radio off. For the moment, it felt best to hold off on filling the Crown Victoria's interior with music. At the park's exit, he stopped to check for surrounding traffic and looked back to see the paramedics once more. It was a matter of finding some kind of closure. He needed to know the man was okay before driving away. With the engine idling and no traffic approaching on the empty cliffside road, he looked in his rearview and side mirrors. The paramedics assisted the man into the passenger seat of his car. Hector's mind went blank for a moment, and he found himself looking for the cobalt blue SUV. That was until the chirp of a car horn alerted him to the fact that he was holding up the park exit, and he accelerated into a right turn.